So, welcome everybody to this critical mental health seminar series. My name is and it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Domonkos today, who is already with us, and who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the Eötvös Lorand University. I don't know how to pronounce it, in Budapest. I don't speak Hungarian, and I wish I could speak. And alumni of the CEU in Budapest, Vienna now. And his research focuses on critical theory, including political culture and mental disorders in late modernity. And today we'll hear and listen to his presentation based, I think, on his latest book, Empty Suffering, that was published by Routledge in 2022. So, if I may, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind invitation and for your kind words. And now I try to share my screen. Okay, does it working? Okay. So first of all, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming and joining this presentation. Before I would start the presentation itself, let me start by saying a few words of how and why do I work on these subjects and issues. I originally started my career with researching topics like civic society and democratic culture and socialization, and all these topics were very interesting from a critical theoretical perspective. All these topics seemed very important in the post-transition Hungarian context, and that is something probably which you can relate to as well from Poland, that all these democratic transitions, how much importance they had for quite a long time, and they still have. But after a while, my interest was more and more changing a little bit, and that was not independent from the transition of the political scene itself. As you are probably aware of the current trends in Hungary, which can be called the building of the illiberal democracy. And in that atmosphere, talking about democratic culture and democratic socialization seemed more and more remote from the everyday experiences. So it was more and more important to think a little bit of the other side of these processes. And the other side of these processes, that is the lack of a space for agency for many social actors. That is what led me primarily to the questions of mental disorders, and but particularly mental disorders like depression or anxiety or addictions, which are, in my understanding, very much interrelated with the structural distortions, including not just the political structures, of course, but also the economic ones as well, the cultural ones as well. So that is just a basic introduction, what it was my personal role to this topic. Now, of course, why cannot I change? Okay, now it's good. Now, of course, if someone would like to deal with these questions, there is quite a lot of heritage within the critical theoretical tradition itself. Critical theories dealing from beginning with phenomena like alienation, like in case of Marx, for example, or anomy in case of Durkheim, or loss of meaning in case of Weber, and all these phenomena are to be defined in one way or another as a form of social suffering. That is some sort of transformation of the mental condition of the individuals as well, due to the transformations of the social structure. However, there is as I've been trying to learn more about these classic diagnosis of times, I realized that most of the critical theories sooner or later, when it came to the experience of suffering itself, were very limited in extent. There is no big description of the phenomenological content of either alienation or anomaly, while in both cases, these are very strong metaphors of suffering. It is not really elaborated in empirical sense. And that made me wonder, why is this the situation? Why isn't sociology and sociological approaches are having a more elaborated concept of suffering, when social suffering is the final ground and the final normative basis of most of these critical theoretical observations? So that got my attention very much, and I was trying to read about it more and more, and I realized that that thing, that tendency is very much related to a disciplinary divide between those disciplines who are supposed to talk about the empirical extent and empirical depth of suffering. And these are mostly the therapeutic disciplines, which are mostly treated by critical theories as the subject of criticism itself. Think about the Foucauldian tradition, Nicolas Rose's tradition writing about, or Goffman's tradition writing about the distortions of the psychological and psychiatric discourses and praxes themselves. So in critical theory, while on the one hand there is a really strong need to talk about suffering because of the inherent suspicion towards those disciplines, those mostly therapeutic disciplines who are dealing with these forms of suffering in an empirical way, that resulted that somehow it remains unelaborated. And I was trying to work around these divisions because I think that there is a need for dialoguing between these disciplinary discourses. Now, how to do this dialogue is a tricky question itself, and it made me a lot of work to think about it. How can it be grounded appropriately? How can the translation between the critical theoretical and psychological discourses be managed? And in this sense, I was very happy when I realized that it should be phenomenology and the phenomenological tradition which could provide a lot of assistance here, because phenomenology, its original goal and its original aim was going back to the experiences themselves. And of course, these experiences, the birth of these experiences and the birth of the meanings related to the experiences are obviously explicable and explained by the various disciplines in a different way. However, a phenomenological psychology or a phenomenological sociology or history or philosophy, they are all having their ground level on the level of describing the meaning construction processes themselves. That is why I think that phenomenology in general is very, very handy when it comes to trying to combine these sorts of knowledge. Now, today I would like to talk about one particular aspect of these researches, and that is the genealogy of depression. And in this sense, what I will focus on, obviously, is on the one hand will be about the phenomenological descriptions of depression itself. And here are some very, very great scholars to be mentioned, like Matthew Radcliffe or Thomas Fuchs. Probably they don't need to be introduced in this circle. And I think that their analysis of depression is very relatable to sociological analysis in the sense that those dimensions of a depressed life world or depressed existence that they are reconstructing are reinterpretable and reusable in a sociological and in a historical context as well. And that is which will lead me to my first question today, that is the historical analysis of the phenomenological constituents of depression. And here, just as a methodological note, I would like to highlight two authors who are very important for me. One is, of course, Max Weber's notion of ideal type. When it comes to analyzing long-term historical processes, I think it's a very good methodological tool to rely on, constructing idealtypical transformations, which means that these transformations are obviously not going to be covering the heterogeneity of the experiences themselves, but they are going to cover the central causal transformations, if you like, those transformations which can be called with the words of Ferdinand Brodel, the structures of everyday life. Okay, so these structures of everyday life are very much, in my understanding, which define the space of possibility, the horizon of actors. And if we can find and identify these key structures, then that helps us a lot to describe the life worlds themselves in historical context as well. So in this sense, these two are going to be combined, and I am going to focus on those structures of everyday life, which are also the key constituents of a depressed life world as well. Okay, if I will have time after doing this, I will try to elaborate a little bit on the contemporary social constituents of depression, because I think that's another story. It's related to the genealogy, but with the help of genealogy, you can define those structures which are the general framework. But obviously, if there is a structural framework, that doesn't mean that it is deterministic at all. It does not make everyone depressed who is living under those conditions. So there is a need for reconstructing those micro and meso mechanisms which are transmitting the structural distortions to the individual level. And these are going to be also explored a little bit today, once again, only if I have enough time, because I'm well aware that listening to Teams or Zoom presentations is quite exhausting itself. So I would not like to misuse your patience. And I would like to provide also space for discussions, because I'm very interested in your reflections as well. Okay, and if that is done, then just a little bit I will talk about the consequences of this analysis. I think it has a lot of consequences on practical level, both when it comes to the sociological analysis of emancipatory praxis or solidarity patterns, and both when it comes to thinking about therapy in a late modern condition in a non-essentializing way. Okay, so let's start it. The phenomenological constituents of depression. First question which needs to be answered is the phenomenological one. On what level, on what extent do we think that depression affects one's being in the world, one's existence, or one's life world? And there are different solutions to this. Some who's working in the Heideggerian tradition might think that depression, might argue that depression is a mood or an attunement. Others might argue that it is an existential feeling, which means that it is not just an everyday attunement, but an attunement which is having stakes or concerning the existential status of the individual, the subject. And there is another approach which argues that depression should be understood as an existential structure, which means that it is reconfiguring the totality of the life world, or the chiasm, if you think with Merleau-Ponty's or Husserl's conceptualization. I think that there is no necessary need to choose between these different approaches. Just the depression and the experience of depression is a gradual experience. It's not a binary one. It's more like a scale. We can argue that the less severe forms of depression can be understood as moods, and the most severe ones as existential structures. But that's not that important for us now. What is more important is to identify the phenomenological constituents of a depressed being in the world or life world. And the first element of this framework is the reconfiguration of the embodied existence. What does it mean? This means that just like in case of many illness experiences, in case of the depression experience, at the center of the experience, there lies the transformation of the horizon of the world. Instead of being, or what used to be, a horizon full of possibilities, full of prospects and perspective of inhabiting the world, is transforming. It is going to be the horizon of impossibilities, of obstacles, of hindrances, of limitations. And this reconfiguration is not just happening on the level of consciousness, on the level of the mind, but it's happening on the very level of embodied existence. That is why the key feature of depression, like the impossibility or incapability of enjoyment, is occurring on an embodied, visceral, corporeal level. Now, in case of depression, however, this reconfiguration of embodiment is complemented with several factors. One of the key factors is the reconfiguration of time consciousness. It has two aspects. One aspect is, while in case of a non-depressed life world, time is constituted at least two very different dimensions. One is a linear time leading from the past, which is reliable and a little bit reconfigurable from the perspective of the present by remembering it and by retelling it, and while creating narratives around it, and leading to the future, which is also, this is the linear aspect, which is also imagined in the non-depressed life world as something which is flexible, which is not determined, but which is shapeable by the actors themselves. Now, that is what is not given for a depressed life world. In the depressed life world, time is very narrowed, in a sense that it is limited to the present, and it is limited to a circular time where neither the past seems to be retoldable, re-narratable, nor the future seems to be reconfigurable or shapeable. So in this sense, what is the time framework of a depressed life world is repetition, or in many narratives, it is a frozen time. That is a very metaphorical expression of the stop, basically, of the stopping of a linear time, flow of a linear time. Okay, now obviously these two components are not enough to explain the depression experience. There is a need for another aspect, and that aspect is somehow coming from these previous two. This aspect is the reconfiguration of agency. The depressed subjects or actors are losing basically their agency instead of engaging with the elements surrounding them, with the things surrounding them. Instead of trying to consume them, enjoy them, intertwine with them, they are restricting themselves to from these sorts of interactions, and they are limiting themselves to passivity most of the time. That doesn't need too much explanation, I think, why it is related to the lack of linear time. If you don't have a transformable future and past, there is no real horizon where you can imagine your agency, your activity. And they do not have these perspectives, so there is no real space for acting either. One particular dimension where this lack of agency is becoming even more important is the space of intersubjectivity. In intersubjective relations, basically, one could experience a different sort of engagement with the world than in the relation with the material environment, and that is the interaffectivity, the aspect of interaffectivity. That is basically the resonation to the other's affective structures or moods or attunements. Basically, in a depressed life world, that is what is going to be the cornerstone, the final element on the feeling of permanency related to depression. That life world itself is not affectable by others. Others cannot really enter to the depressed life world. Their emotions cannot enter that life world. So the depressed emotion is going to be the only available one on the horizon, and that is going to result in its absolutization, in its totalization. That is the cornerstone of a depressed life world. So basically, if we would like to understand depression from a phenomenological perspective, we can say that these components are gradually and interrelatedly express the more and more severe forms of depression, and that enables us to think about those structures of everyday life which affect embodied existence, time consciousness, agency, and intersubjectivity, not just in the present, but also with the help of social history. Especially, I'm thinking here now, referring here now the originally French school of the Annales. Like you will see some prominent authors in the references. In a social historical analysis, we can also try and think about how in various periods embodied existence, time consciousness, agency, and intersubjectivity is structured idealtypically. Why is this important? I think it's very important and very interesting because we are thinking usually or imagining usually depression as a malaise, the modernity, which means that as a modern phenomenon, as a modern experience of distorted life world. But there is very little tools, very few tools to falsify or to check whether it is true or not. For obvious reasons, health statistics are available for a very limited time, and this is mostly modernity, mostly in the second half of 20th century. Not to mention that there are many questions and methodological and epistemological ones related to the statistics themselves. So it's very difficult to say that in what extent is it true that the depression-related experiences of what we call now depression are unique or more frequent in modern era, modern times than before. And I think it is a good way to avoid these traps if we are trying to do what I call a genealogy of depressed lifeworld, which is instead of trying to find these statistical factors, is approaching the probability of depression from the perspective of the probability of its structural constituents in various periods. And what I would like to focus now today in today's presentation is one particular shift, paradigm shift, if you like, between the late medieval and early modern times. And why I'm choosing this is because I think at this time there are very important structural transformations of embodiment, of time consciousness, of agency and intersubjectivity. And these structural transformations are going to reconfigure the space of possibility of depression itself as well. So what I'm going to do now is very quickly run through these four dimensions in the late modern and in the early modern era, and we will end up in this table. And don't worry, I'm not going to go into detail in case of every aspect, but I would like to provide just a short overview. Okay, so first question, late medieval embodied existence. What needs to be emphasized here is a very simple thing that obviously we are, first of all, the periodization, it's not obvious. By late medieval times, I mean the period basically between the 10th and 13th centuries, and mostly in the Christian Europe. And why the boundary, time boundary here? Because after the 13th century, there are going to be new phenomena, starting with the Renaissance, starting with the new Protestant movement, starting with the exploration, starting with the commercialization, urbanization, and all these things. And these are basically what early modernity is about, at least according to this idealtypical divide. Okay, so late medieval embodied existence. What needs to be emphasized is that obviously after the fall of the Roman Empire, there is a really big technological backdrop or limitation, and this is very much related to the way the life world is organized. Novelty is considered to be sinful. Worldly suffering is not considered to be something which is to be prevented. Instead, in many cases, it was considered to be as a punishment of God, or as even in some cases, it was cultivated as a virtue. The more punishment, the more suffering one endures on physical level, the more virtuous they seemed. Why? Because the body itself, according to the Christian metaphysics, is basically the place for sins, and basically a battleground for devilish forces and angelic forces. So at minimum, to say the least, it is something which is suspicious, and it is not to be cultivated at all. In this sense, and due to these tendencies, there was, compared to the modern times, there was quite a lot of physical suffering being experienced, but it was very much naturalized. Both hungers, both exhaustive physical labor, these are naturalized and also embedded in the religious work ethics as well. So obviously, due to the lack of commerce and technological innovation, there was very small space of consumption as well. And that resulted in some that even though there was a very burdensome embodiment, which in itself would be very much relatable to the experience of depressed life, despite this burdensome embodiment, there was a very strong transcendental justification of this sort of suffering. And that is, these two factors are going to be important together. Now, when it comes to time consciousness in the late medieval era, I would say it is very much the predominance of eschatological time framework, which means that worldly time itself is considered to be non-significant. If you think about your existence as a short intermezzo between the expelling from paradise and apocalypse and the eternities before and after these short worldly historical time, then simply the worldly time does not have that much importance. And that will mean that the linear time, it exists, but not in a worldly context, but in an eschatological context. And also, there is no real reason for creating a differentiated life course or a differentiated historical model for existence. Simply, these are not the organizing factors of temporal existence in these times. So, in this sense, the predominance of religious time semantics is what needs to be emphasized at this point. And when it came to worldly time, it was much more about circularity, which was experienced. What about agency? Individual freedom as such in the late medieval era was very different. I could also say that it was completely lacking in a sense as we are thinking today to freedom. Instead, freedom meant to be in a position in the worldly hierarchies, which are of course the representations of the transcendental hierarchies, and then everyone is basically predetermined one way or another by the providence, but having different spaces of agency depended, of course, on what authorities one had in these mostly feudal structures. So in this sense, agency was in general quite limited, and individual freedom was not really on the horizon of the actors themselves. That was also related, and that also implied that instrumental knowledge and instrumental accumulation of knowledge, which could have enabled some sort of control over natural forces or over social processes, was also very limited. One complementary aspect is the question of property, which is going to be very much related to agency later on. That is also something which is completely uncertain. First of all, it is not related to individuals individuals do not have that sort of property concept that we are having now, that property is something which is unalienable from the individual. Properties were given and taken according to the feudal chains, and in this sense, it was not something to rely on as a basis of agency, as a platform of investment or accumulation. Now, on the other hand, there were some supplementary spaces for agency. One was, of course, the religious praxis. That was very important to impact one's redemption on the one hand, and also the living according to the religious ethics. And besides the official church rules and ethics, there was also space for the underground practices of magic and witchcraft, of course. There are very interesting descriptions of this in the social historical sources. And besides these individual practices, collective action also had its framework. However, these collective actions were usually revolt against the feudal hierarchies, not with the intention of changing it, but mostly for the unbearability of suffering they burden on the individuals, mostly in case of hunger. Besides these revolts, these outbursts of collective action, one interesting phenomenon also should be mentioned. That is the carnivals, the culture of carnivals. These were occasions for turning inside out the worldly social structure, even for a very limited day. During these periods, the social distinctions, which otherwise predetermined the space of agency, were given up for a short period of time. Okay, but besides these phenomena, what is important is that agency is much more limited in these times, and very, very different substantively compared to the modern ones. Now, when it comes to intersubjectivity, it's very important and very interesting, I think, that on the one hand, there is a really strong interdependence on material and corporeal level. In terms of survival itself, depended very much on being together because of an undomesticated natural environment and an insecure farming culture. You were very much relying on what we would call now today community-based solidarity networks. The concept of individual itself is very much missing. It is not the person themselves, which is the basic of subjectivity. With Foucault, we can imagine that there were no such technologies of the self which could enable the individual construction of the self. But instead, there were family or local factors which served as a basis of identification. It is even more important, probably, that it's not just the narrative structures of the self, individual self, which are missing, but also the spatial structures. There is no space for privacy. All those activities, which we are considering many of them nowadays to be done as a lonely activity, were all made in community basis. So what characterized this era is a really strong and really dense intersubjective networks and the really strong sense of what we can call with the collective consciousness and collective representations. However, these intersubjectivities were obviously having their burdens because they were very much serving as a surveillance structure as well. Being alone was also considered to be very dangerous because one alone was considered to be more susceptible to the devilish influences, and that is why the community always felt responsible to survey each other, its members. Now, that being said, we can turn our attention to the changes and transformations. And of course, while the medieval era itself, especially if we're talking about several centuries long, and we don't think about the local differences, which were quite relevant, of course. The medieval era should not be viewed, of course, as a homogeneous thing. There were very severe underlying legitimacy crises, if you like. And even if these crises were very much pacified or suppressed by either the church and the faith or by the worldly authorities, but they were present continuously throughout the late medieval era, and they've been contesting both the church authority and the worldly authorities as well. Heresy and heretic religious ideas were present during this period all the time, and they've been very much suppressed, just as there were continuous contests of the ownership over the ownership of worldly authority as well. So these crises are very important on their own, but beside these crises, those transformations should also be mentioned, which were more or less external to the late medieval constellation. And these external events can be labeled as the events related to the opening of the world, gradual opening of the world due to the intensifying commercial relations, and also due to the gradual explorations. The first consequence of all these transformations was very much observable in the Renaissance city-states, where gradually a new relation to embodiment emerged. Instead, or beside, I would rather say beside, looking at body in the traditional Christian way as a platform of sins, body also became the place where one could represent, show off their social status. And it would also become a place where one could cultivate its body and enjoy their body. So in this sense, the pleasant sensations which previously were mostly treated as fundamentally sinful, they have been also becoming legitimate goals. Even if these transformations occurred, it should not be viewed that they replaced the previous embodiment paradigm, if you let me say this. Instead, what happened is two parallel embodiment paradigms emerged. One which was more remaining in the medieval framework, and that was very much reinforced by all those uncontrollable events like the still persisting and existing illnesses like plague, or the still ever-present threat of hunger, and the still present very hard physical labor demands. This was very much present in this era as well. But besides this, there was also a space opening, a horizon opening for a new relation to embodiment, which is very much similar to how we are inhabiting our bodily existence. Similar transformations characterized the transformation of time consciousness as well. Beside the eschatological time, which remained as important and which remained as an important supplementary if the worldly temporal structures failed a man, there was a new temporal framework, both on individual level in the sense of social mobility, which once again, mostly in these city-state constellation. Italian city-state constellation was an actual possibility. Worldly mobility means that there is a future on individual level to be conquered. Besides the individual framework of future, the collective future, the world, the historical time consciousness became also very much important. So in this sense, future became open, became a terrain of worldly success or failure. And this new linear worldly time was complementing the eschatological. One important transformation on the level of agency concerned the birth of a new and more secure space for property. It was not really a property as we imagine it today. It was not really based on money, because money itself was quite unreliable as a form of saving. It was much more based on objectified and material things, but still property as a legal entity became more and more reliable outside of the feudal chains. Of course, in feudal chains, it was still the prebendal and patrimonial structures which defined the space of property. But in the cities, in the urbanized areas, property was much more based on what we are looking at today, on a social contract, on the acknowledgement of the others to one's right to own a certain thing. Jumping a little bit in time towards the birth of Protestantism, the Protestant ethics created also very interesting change because property itself became somehow synthesized with the transcendental because it was looked by, especially in the Calvinist theology, as a sign of being chosen to enter the paradise in the afterlife. Although according to Calvinism, there is predetermination of who is going to be redeemed and who is not. Still, those who are gaining this right get signs from providence, from God, through material success, through the increase or the accumulation of one's property. So in this sense, property became very much a platform for worldly agency. Social status was also very much attached to it. Morality itself was very much reconfiguring around it. Christian duty, which was solely and exclusively focusing on redemption, were more and more complemented, contested, and sometimes countered by the worldly virtues, providing success and the questions of honor as well. That made an impact, of course, on the legitimacy structure, on power structures, and it's enough, I think, to refer here just Machiavelli's book, The Prince, which describes very much how early modern political philosophy was registering these transformations. Okay, so here we are clearly seeing a new space for agency. And what we are also saying along this transformation is the transformation of intersubjectivity itself. This new form of agency reconfigures social relationships in terms of making the property acquisition, that is the market transactions, a very important platform for interacting with the other. However, these early modern social contests were very unregulated, I can say. And that's why they are very often overlapped with questions of honor. And that's why, if you think about it from the perspective of feudalistic chains being replaced by patron-client chains. There is a transformation, but there is quite a lot of similarity, and it's quite different compared to today's very clear impersonal market transactions. So in this sense, it's very tangible how the feudalistic, on a feudalistic basis, these new ties are being built up. And of course, that resulted in very rupturing and very explosive social dynamics in the medieval intersubjective structures, which were on the one hand countered by new phenomena like the friendships based on equity and all those new narratives of the self and the other, these relations as being explored in new literary forms. And also, it needs to be mentioned the new desire for privacy was emerging, but that does not mean that this privacy was very much available to many people. Instead, intersubjectivity was still very dense, but it was becoming more heterogeneous, more multiple structures characterizing it, and it was more conflicting in many sense. So what we are having here is basically a transformation in all these dimensions. While in the late medieval era, if you would like to evaluate it from the perspective of depression, we can say that on the one hand, there is a very strong indication towards depression. That is the very strong suffering-full embodied existence. But this very strong indication is countered by other things. Besides this suffering-full existence, there is, of course, the lack of agency, which these two are very strong indications towards depression. But there is a very strong element of a dense interaffectivity, and there is a very strong element of a temporal horizon, which is pointing outside from worldly existence, which is a linear prospect of salvation, basically. So in this sense, even if there was a big chance from the perspective of embodiment and agency for depression to emerge, the transcendental justification of suffering and lack of agency, and the transcendental horizon of time, of transcendental time, and the very strong intersubjectivity structures providing space for interaffectivity, preventing social isolation very much, which is an important factor for depression. Altogether, this made, in my understanding, depression not a frequent experience. However, in the early modernity, this, let's say, from the perspective of depression, balanced condition was slowly and gradually shifting. A new dimension of existence, existential dimension emerged, both on the level of embodiment, both on the level of time consciousness, both on the level of agency. And all these things together made the intersubjectivity a much more conflicting space. In this space, however, in this constellation, however, I would not really say that depression was a typical experience either. If we are looking for sources like diaries, for example, in the late medieval era, we are finding depression descriptions, usually by monks, for example, who has been losing their faith. And in their case, it's very obvious why they were more susceptible to depression, because they've lost their justificatory, legitimizing narrative. In case of early modernity, we can see some entrepreneurs, early modern entrepreneurs, who are becoming depressed due to their overworking, but they think looking at depression as somehow the cost of their lifestyle. But usually depression or the traces of depression, I would say, because obviously the notion itself is originating from the 19th century, so it's no depression, melancholy or aisedia, as it was earlier called. Usually, that cannot be said it's a typical experience. What is going to make it typical, in my understanding, is another transformation, and the transformation is originating from the social sphere becoming much more explosive and much more full with conflict. And the transformation is going to be about the birth of a new property concept, a new imagination of what owning could mean. And that new concept is going to be the birth of absolute dominion. Absolute dominion differs from the medieval and early modern conceptualization of property in a sense that on the one hand, it attributes owning to the individual. On the other hand, by owning, it attributes absolute control over the owned thing. And that is something which is quite unprecedented before. Why? First of all, because control was mainly considered to be belonging to the transcendental, to providence, to God. So there was no such horizon that individual actors could control completely anything by owning them. And on the other hand, it was not individuals, just as I said before as well, but it was mostly families who were entitled to own anything. And with the notion of absolute dominion, this has been changing. A new concept of property emerged, and this new concept of property affected not just the commercial transactions, but the whole structure of the life world itself. It was very important that it transformed the concepts of embodiment, agency, time consciousness, and interaffectivity itself. The individual was differentiated from the other, against the other, more and more. And that's what created in the early modern social philosophies, like in case of Hobbes or Locke, these atomized concepts of the social being who is defined against the other individuals. The whole idea of controlling the world with the emergence of obviously early natural sciences was very much relatable to what it meant to be owning a thing, and that was of course very much exploited in the era of early modern slavery, where other individuals became properties, and that meant that complete control over their existence, something which was also unimaginable within the Christian concept of what it means to be human. So in this sense, these transformations affected all the factors of life, and they created in a long historical process a trajectory where the whole structural framework of depression was reconfigured. What I would like to emphasize here, and I will stop there because I see that I'm talking almost an hour now, and I would like to open the discussion. So what can be said that before depression, if we look back to these tables, was dependent on multiplied independent parallel dimensions. So this means that if you were to become depressed in late medieval era, you had to first endure embodied suffering, secondly, somehow lose the providential time framework, lose your agency, and being socially isolated. That's why I said that it was, at least from the descriptions we know, it was monks who has been referring to experiences like this, who has been losing their faith. In early modernity, to become depressed, you had to also not being able to access the transcendental justifications or narratives of existence, while also enduring suffering, while also not being able to find future hope perspectives, either in eschatological or in worldly time. You also had to lose your agency, both in Christian sense, in sense of an ethical life, and both in sense of worldly success, and also you had to be somehow socially isolated to make it all probable. But as absolute dominion became the basis of property, and social relations were reconfigured around this concept of property, all these factors were somehow becoming interdependent, which means that suffering, time consciousness, agency, and intersubjectivity all started to depend on basically the quantity of the owned property. If you had the property, you had the means to overcome embodied suffering. You had the perspective of accumulation or maintaining your status. You had the space for agency in consumption and investment or whatever. And you also had the space for interactions, intersubjectivity by relying on your social status and by referring to your own property. So this meant that the failure of property had more and more impact on the totality of life. If someone was starting to work in this framework, starting to move in this trajectory, and enter the arena of a worldly existence, an exclusive worldly existence, for them, this successfulness in the field of absolute dominion became the key factor of all these phenomenological constituents. And the failure in this sense made very much susceptible to the depressed experience. And one last remark here, because I don't want you to misunderstand this. This obviously does not mean that depression equals poverty in modern context. No, that's why I was also wanted to talk about the late modern components and integration mechanisms which are translating this susceptibility, this structural susceptibility to the individual level. What matters is that on the level of the structures of everyday life, there is a much bigger idealtypical sense. There is a much bigger interrelatedness of those phenomenological structures which used to be independent from each other. And this interrelatedness creates the vulnerability, the structural exposedness to the experience of depression in modern times, in my understanding. And to refine these ideas, of course, one needs to not stop at the early modern times, but go to the contemporary social structures. But maybe in discussion we can come back to this. I would like to stop here now. And thank you very much for the attention. And I'm really very much looking for your questions.
Okay, thank you so much for this really dense overview, historically and culturally dense. And yeah, I would like to open the floor for questions and comments. You can ask the questions by unmuting yourself or just in the chat function. It's fine, however you want. And also for those who would like to show their faces and have this possibility, it would be nice to you know.
Yeah.
Okay, so can I go or somebody else?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, first of all, thank you so much for this fascinating and very rich, like historically account. This is really inspiring for my own research. But I must say, as inspiring as I found this this notion of like agency and property to analyze the phenomenon of depression, I do not like completely understand where like this notion of property and absolute dominion, which I also like understand as maybe birth of individualism, and this is one question to you. But somehow I'm just curious, like, why this as an analytical category?
Mm-hmm.
Why not alienation? Because I don't know, like I think alienation is just one, maybe another name or one aspect of this. And yeah, it's like this is really inspiring, but because when I read just shortly, when I read economic philosophical manuscripts in Harks, and this like exactly the fragments about alienation, I was also thinking that this is just like a description of this like actually late modern or like early capitalist trauma of like, I know, deprivation basically on many levels. But yeah, I would like to ask you exactly about the like why like you think that this property and absolute dominion is central, because it sounds like this, but somehow I feel like there is some kind of a like intellectual jump, or just like that I do not completely understand.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Beatka, for the question, and it is absolutely my mistake that I did not explain this in detail. But I hope you will forgive me, because obviously what I'm trying to talk about now is even if that's the first chapter of a book, but it's part of a larger elaborated unit, and that's why it's probably not comprehensible at this phase. So first of all, what is really important in a genealogical exploration, in my understanding, is to to grasp that historical moment when the gradual and slow latent structural movements are manifesting into a new social, I don't know, social fact in Durkheimian sense. And in my understanding, the birth of absolute property indicates such historical shift, and it is much earlier than Marx's work on alienation, which he is defining from the perspective of capitalism, and it's a 19th century economical structure which he's talking about. But while it on a phenomenological sense, it can be related to depression in many ways. I agree with that, although it's not elaborated just as much as the phenomenologies of depression are, but it can be related. And there are many contemporary critical theories who are relating, for example, like Yagi or Arthur Rosa, if you are maybe familiar with these social theoreticians. So it can be related, but it will not tell us about the moment of the birth of a new structure. And why is it important to see the birth? Because if you are looking at these phenomena from the contemporary perspective, or even from the 19th century perspective, you will not be able to see what is being lost while this new structure has been emerging. And I think it's very important, and that's why I'm calling this whole book, why the title is Empty Suffering. What is the key element here is somehow the emptying of suffering experience itself, suffering in terms of embodied suffering, physical suffering, suffering in terms of the temporal perspective, as in terms of the lack of agency, in terms of intersubjectivity. And by emptying, I mean that with the birth of absolute dominion, there is a transformation on the level of basically philosophy of religion, theology, and these sorts of things. Because in the medieval era, you have a really strong metaphysical, theological grounding of the social world, including the narrating of suffering, all these sorts of suffering, which are even more burdensome from the present perspective on the level of embodiment, on the level of oppression, and all these things. Don't get me wrong, the medieval era was much a worse place in this sense. But the suffering experience itself was not empty in terms of having a transcendental meaning, a narration related to it. And here there is a very important inspiration for me, Arthur Kleinman, if you are familiar with the illness narratives. The question of illness narrative. Today, we are looking at all these mental disorders as diseases framed within the biomedical discursive framework as illnesses of the body or the mind. Choose it however you want, which means that there is not even a possibility of meanings related to these sufferings besides the dysfunctional mind or the dysfunctional body. And that is the present perspective. And that is what makes you think probably that these states of mind are naturally or evidently emptied from narrative structures. But if we go back in time, and the more we go back, we see that because there are no technologies to control the causes of these illnesses or mental disorders, instead of handling the causes or controlling the causes, there is a really big space for narrating the suffering. That is going to be a completely different way of dealing with suffering. If you cannot control the causes, you can still do the narrative framing. And modernization is a process while the control option is going to grow up, and this is going to be falling behind very much. And that is going to result in the present situation where we are having only this, basically, and we don't have any sort. But don't get me wrong, I don't mean that narrating the suffering is better than controlling the causes. Don't think about it this way. What I'm trying to emphasize is that we should not forget about the narrating dimension either, because that is very important. And of course, in situations when the control doesn't work, which is happening in today's societies as well, but there are a lot of illnesses and mental disorders where the control function has its limitations as well. The narration becoming very important, and all those social praxes which are related to the narration, including the solidarity praxis, including the intersubjective, interaffective praxis. So what I'm trying to do is to show that how these two things are related. And in the absolute dominion concept, you can clearly see that, for example, in John Locke's philosophy, who is at the border of modernity and modern social philosophy. He's also involved in the Christian theological justifications, while also creating a sense of property which is going to be separated from this. So if you want to get this property concept, that means that you are going to cut the links from the transcendental one. And that is not just happening on the level of philosophy, that is going to be affecting the horizon of the actors themselves throughout the society. What sort of property they are having will mean that what sort of narratives will they have when it comes to operating outside of the realm of the owning. So that's why it's important for me to talk besides alienation, which I think is a beautiful concept as well, and it's a strong concept as well, but it is simply not capable to show the genealogical aspect of the transformation of suffering itself as being losing its narrative elements for the sake of improving the control elements. And while we are in the 19th century, there is no really more narrative sources. It's just about the social classes and the access to capital and all these sorts of things.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Domonkos, could you kind of close the screen because I can't really do it, and I think it might be a bit nicer for us. We can. Oh yeah. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
No, it's totally cool. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Maybe I would like to ask you something because it's intriguing for me that we are using this term depression in a very in a long view context, while it's really a modern concept. And I was wondering what your solution to this issue would be, and it seems like you are using the term suffering. That it makes more sense in a way. And how would you connect these two?
Yes, that's also important, and that's something I could not talk about in detail, and I decided not to talk about this in detail. But that's a big question, of course. What can we do with the temporal embeddedness of the very concept of depression itself? And I'm coming from a sociology and philosophy background. I've been trained as a sociologist and philosopher. I'm not a psychologist. So in this sense, I'm very much respecting the importance of always having this historical reflectivity on the notions which we are using. But on the other hand, I think, and maybe that is from the philosophical background, I think that there are ways to describe phenomenological structures which are historically, if not completely independent from a certain period, but still much more flexible. What do I have in mind? I would not say that in medieval times there were depressed persons. I would not say that in the early modern there were depressed persons are obviously are only existing from the moment the nosology of depression has been burned. But if we are having now the more or less clear criteria of what depression is based on the DSM or whatever, from this description, we can have phenomenological descriptions of what are those constituents of this experience, which are basically I'm not saying they are universal, because that's always a very dangerous word, but which can be compared in different historical settings. You can talk about, and that's what I was trying to do, you can talk about the embodied existence in different social, historical, or cultural, or social contexts. Okay, there are different levels of exposedness to physical suffering, exposedness to hunger, and all those sorts of things. You can talk about time consciousness in different contexts. You can, even if it's going to be very different in different cultural backgrounds or different historical times, but still you can give a description, and also an agency and interaffectivity, how these are emerging on the level of phenomenological structure, on the level of meanings being constructed. And in this sense, if you accept that the depression itself can be decomposed in a phenomenological analysis, and I do accept that. I do believe that the phenomenologies of Radcliffe, who is more of a philosopher, and the phenomenology of Thomas Fuchs, who is more a psychiatric phenomenologist, are good attempts of a phenomenological discussion of what depression is, as it is understood by modern diagnostical criteria. And based on these dissecting of the phenomenon itself, we can compare those phenomenological components independently, which are related to the diagnostic itself. So if you like it, from phenomenology, first you are creating these derivatives, you are dissecting into phenomenological constituents, the DSM definition of depression, and then you are forgetting the DSM definition, and you are just dealing with the phenomenological constituents when it comes to historical analysis. That is what I was trying to do, and of course one should be very cautious, and of course I've been trying to do and find some sources where there are, for example, like diaries or some in the medieval era, more like some literary texts where these sorts of experiences are narrated by the actors themselves, and even though they are not clearly the equivalents of modern day depression, they are very much relatable. If you want me, I can copy here some to the chat, and maybe that will give you some idea.
That would be nice. And as we are really, I know that we started, thank you so much. As we had to start a bit later due to technical issues. But if anyone has like one last question or comment, you are most welcome to ask. Yeah. I think we still have one of this.
So here is one from the Middle Ages. It is it is Abelard's letter. You are probably familiar with that one. And here is one from the.
Okay. Nice.
Here is one from the early modern example. Okay, you can take a look at it later on as well.
All right, thank you. Okay, any other comments? I think you just gave us a lot of food for thought, and it's probably such a dense presentation, and yeah. So you know, we have your email, and I think if someone feels to that they need to and want to ask you a question, they can do
That's
it.
what I wanted to say as well. Thank you very much for contacting, and I'm really glad that we did. And if any of you is interested in the book itself, I'm more than glad to send it over. Yeah, if there are any follow-up questions or anything, don't hesitate to write me. I'm really interested in these things, so I'm gladly making connections around these topics.
Okay, so thank you so much, and I would like to invite you to our next seminar on November 21st. Domonkos, you are invited to.
Thank you very much.
We'll have Professor Amy Chandler and Dr. Baptiste Broussard who will talk about explaining mental illness, sociological perspectives. So hopefully this time we'll be able to deal with codes and other things. So thank you so much, and thank you, Domonkos, for being our first speaker in this seminar series this year. And yeah, have a nice evening.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.